1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we started 1 Corinthians chapter 7 already. It's got two main divisions. The first one is Paul speaking to the married people. The second division is Paul speaking to the singles. We looked at it last week. Let me see if I can get this up there. He spoke to the Christian couples. He told them that there were some things. Let me go ahead and get all of them up there. There. He spoke to the Christian couples first of all. And now what he's trying to do, we see in verse 2, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, he says, to let each man have his own wife, let each woman have her own husband. So what Paul was trying to do was he was helping the Corinthians, teaching them, but helping them to limit the sexual immorality that was taking place even in the church. And his first remedy to that was to tell them, hey, he said in verse 1 that it's good for people to stay single. He says, but if you can't handle that, if there's too much temptation, then you need to get married, he told them. And so he gave some instructions to the Christian couples to say that they needed to be showing affection to one another, that they needed to give authority of their own bodies over to their spouse. He said the wife's body is not her own, and the man's body is not his own. They belong to one another, so they ought not just do what they want with it, but it belongs to their spouse. And then thirdly, he said, listen, you need to make a lifelong commitment. You need to stay in the relationship for a lifetime. And I think the majority of us know that, but marriage, obviously, some of you know this also, that marriage is under attack. There are some of you, maybe many of you, that live in homes where you're split up between mom and dad, and sometimes you're with mom and sometimes you're with dad, and things have gone on, and nothing you can do about it, but you're very much aware of that relationships, period, have problems, and being married is not, it's not flowers and roses and white horses and knights in shining armor and princesses and all those things. That sometimes it can be very, very hurtful and very hard, and you understand all of that. So Paul is speaking to the married couples to tell them, and he just gives them a quick kind of rundown. These are not all, this doesn't encompass all that there is to know about being married, but he says, he's talking to them about avoiding sexual immorality, show affection to one another, so that one of them doesn't need to go out and look for affection somewhere else. He said authority, give authority of your body over to your spouse, and then your spouse needs to do the same, and you ought not be just in charge of my own body. It's my body, my choice, and I can go off and do what I want with it and forget my husband or forget my wife. You need to be committed to one another, and then the lifelong commitment needs to be for a lifetime. So what Paul does now, where we're at, is in verse 12. In verse 12, we're still in the first main division, which is speaking to the married people. But now this is one of our subpoints here. Let me go ahead and get that slide out. Where's it at? That is definitely not the wrong. We have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. I think the wrong slides got put up. We need 1 Corinthians 7, part 2. And hopefully that's what I sent. But anyways, we'll move on. What he's going to do now, beginning at verse 12, is he's going to talk to the Christians with an unbelieving spouse. So you have two people that are married. One of them is saved. One of them is not. What does he say to them? In verses 12 and 13, what he does is he tells them to stay married. I'll tell you why he tells them to stay married in just a moment. But let's read verse 12. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe. So there it is. If any brother, that's a Christian, if a Christian guy has a wife who does not believe, meaning she is not a Christian, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. So he says, if you're a Christian guy and you've got a wife that's not saved, but she's willing to stay and to live with you and to be married to you, then don't divorce her. Stay committed. Verse 13, he says the same thing to the ladies and a woman who has a husband who does not believe. It's the same thing. Let's say she's a Christian, but she has a husband that's not a Christian. She says, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Now, it seems kind of odd. Like, why would Paul even go there? Like if they're married, they should just stay married, right? Well, it is believed that some in the Corinthian church where they were married already, and then one spouse got saved. And then they go home, and they invite the other spouse, hey, would you like to come to church, And, well, what do you guys do there? Well, we sing some hymns, and, somebody shares God's word with us, and, we fellowship, and the spouse is like, maybe the husband is like, what? So when do you guys do it? Well, we do it on Sundays. Sundays? Well, that's football day. I'm not going to church on that day. That's like, why in the world would I do that? Or, that's soccer Sunday. Like, I can't, why would I go to church? I could stay here and watch soccer. I'm not going to that. So whatever the reason the spouse had, the spouse was like, no, I don't want to go, and I don't want to be saved. And what was happening was that some of those Christian spouses were saying, well, you hear that kid screaming? Like, just bloody murder, huh? It's like, yeah. Forget the distractions of leaving the room. How far outweighs it? Poor little kid. Lord, we pray that you would shut him up. Just kidding. Just kidding. But here's the deal, is that probably some of the Christian spouses were divorcing their unbelieving spouses. They were saying, hey, you don't want to get saved, and you know what, I need a saved husband, or I need a saved wife, and you know what, I'm gonna divorce you, man. And so they were leaving. And so Paul there says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. If you're a Christian, but your spouse is an unbeliever, as long as they're willing to stay with you and live with you and, continue to be married to you, then don't divorce them. Don't leave them. That would be a terrible witness. Hey, I'm divorcing you, you bum, because, you don't want to get saved. Doesn't make any sense. What you want to do is be a good witness to whoever you are with already. Now, keep in mind that this has to do with husbands and wives, spouses, okay? This does not necessarily, in fact, I will go ahead and say it, it doesn't apply to like a dating relationship. Those are different circumstances. You're not married yet. There's no lifelong commitment. There's no commitment before God there. And so it may be that, in fact, if you're dating someone who's not a Christian, it may be time to, to call it quits on that. But to the husbands and wives, stay married. And he tells them why in verse 14. He says, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. What in the world does that mean? Does that mean that if the spouse is a Christian, but the other spouse is not a Christian, that the one that's not a Christian is automatically saved because the other spouse is a Christian? That's not what Paul is saying there. What Paul is saying is that the Christian spouse who's in a marriage and married to somebody who's not a Christian, okay, brings a sanctifying effect to that marriage. Or it might be easier for us to understand saying this, that the Christian in the relationship brings God's blessing onto the relationship. And he's going to go a little bit further here in just a moment. So what he's telling us, are they, I don't know if these are, those still the old ones? Did I just give you the wrong ones? Is that what happened? We don't know. Okay. He's going to tell them, so if you're taking notes, under the, so we said Christians with an unbelieving spouse. We said stay married. The reason to stay married is because you would have a sanctifying effect on that spouse. Okay? You would be a blessing to them. You would bring God's blessing into the marriage. In a minute, he's going to bring up the topic of salvation. We'll get there in just a minute. But in verse 15, he says, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. What exactly is he saying here? He's saying that if this Christian person is married to an unbeliever, if the unbeliever is not a Christian, he or she, if they're willing to stay and continue being married to this Christian, then don't divorce. Stay together, because you're going to be a blessing on that unsaved individual. And in a moment, he'll say, who knows, that unsaved spouse may even get saved because of you. But before he goes there, he throws this in. He says, listen, if you're in a relationship, you've got a Christian, and you're married to somebody who's not a Christian. If the person who is not a Christian doesn't want to stay, they say, you know what? I'm sick and tired of you always bring the Bible around here, and you make my bologna sandwiches for work, but you put a little piece of paper with a scripture in there, and I bite it, and I was like, what is this? Oh, it's John 3:16, for God so loved the world, or whatever. Or every time I go to the bathroom, I lift up the toilet seat, and there's you left you wrote a verse on the toilet seat or something, or whatever. It's like, or sometimes I've heard all kinds of crazy stories about man, my wife is saved now, and the guy's not saved, and she's just always like doing all this crazy stuff, trying to and I get in my car, I start it up, and all of a sudden, boom, the radio's just blaring. It's on K-Wave. You just hear some guy teaching, just in Jesus or whatever, and all this craziness that sometimes the spouses will do to try and get their unsaved spouse saved. It's like we're gonna like put verses everywhere, and we're gonna write on the mirrors, and put it on your radio, and just all of this kind of stuff. And maybe the spouse that's not saved, maybe they go, you know what, I'm tired of this. I don't want to be married to you anymore. Well, what Paul says in verse 15, he speaks to that very briefly. He says, but if the unbeliever departs, if they don't want to be married anymore, he says, let him depart. Let him go. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. In other words, if they want to divorce you, you're to let them divorce you. Now, I think that there's a lot of detail there that's left out. Paul mentions it briefly. Here's the thing. If somebody came to me and said, hey, you know what, I'm married, and this is the situation, I'm a Christian, and they're not, and they want to get divorced, should I just write them off and tell them, hey, forget you, man, or what should I do? I think that I would tell that believing spouse, listen, stay in the marriage as long as you possibly can. Stay in the marriage as long as you possibly can. I understand that unbelieving spouse, they want to leave, but you should do your best to try and hold on to that relationship. If they go ahead with the papers and they're moving ahead and they go ahead and divorce, at some point, what can you do about it? But I think that the Christians should do all that they can to try to win that spouse over to Jesus Christ. I think that they should do all that they can to try and stay in the marriage and remedy the issues and the problems and try to fix those things. But we don't get all that detail in there. Paul just gives us a quick instruction because divorce is not he's not trying to focus on that. He's trying to focus on stay together. He says at the end of verse 15, a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So if they're going to leave, what can you do? He says, but God has called us to peace. In other words, don't fight that spouse. They're an unbeliever and they want to leave you. Don't fight them. And no, you're not leaving anywhere. And, they wake up in the morning and they're chained to the bed or whatever. And you're not getting out of here alive, or, you better, whatever. Paul says, listen, we're called to peace. We want to be to the best of our ability. And this is something that applies to every situation. Every situation that we're involved in. Every Christian, that we should be the peacemakers. We should seek out every possible way that we can to make peace with people. Now, we do have to draw a line at some point. We do not want to compromise our commitment to Christ. It's not like, well, forget Jesus, I just want peace, It's not that. But we should do all that we can to be loving toward people and gentle toward people and forgiving and patient and kind. And we should do all that we can to be at peace with people around us. Sometimes there's just nothing you can do. Sometimes someone is just not going to like you. And sometimes they're going to treat you bad. And there's just nothing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do to change their mind. Some people are just like that. Some people are just angry, or they're just hateful for whatever reason. I don't know, but sometimes they're like that. But Paul says, for us, to the best of our ability, we should be the peacemakers. And that would be obviously in the marriage relationship also. Now, he mentions another reason why they should stay together. Verse 16. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So he says you should stay, if you can, stay with that married to that unbeliever, because you never know. You might actually win them to Christ. When he says you might save them, he doesn't mean like I'm actually going to save my spouse. You know, it's Jesus that would do that. But I may win them to Christ. So I want to try and stay in that kind of a relationship as long as I possibly can. Now, what Paul does in verses 17 down to 24, and that's as far as we will get tonight. From verses 17 to 24, it's almost, you feel like it's kind of like this parenthesis. But it does make sense. We'll start to read through it, because at first it's kind of like, why? I thought he was talking about marriage. Why is he talking about this now? But I'll explain in just a moment. In verse 17, he says, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one. Those are different ways of saying whatever situation you are in at the moment. So, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. He says, and so I ordain in all the churches. So in other words, I teach the same thing in all of the churches, Paul says. What does he mean there in verse 17? And this is what he'll go on to explain. But in verse 17, he's saying, listen, whatever situation you were in when you got saved, just stay there. Okay? Now, again, I have seen over the years, I've seen prostitutes get saved. Now, does Paul say, well, you know, if you were a prostitute when you got saved, you should just stay a prostitute? Obviously not. You know, that's overtly, obviously sin, a sinful lifestyle. He's not saying you should stay in a sinful lifestyle. But remember, he's talking to married couples. And what he's trying to teach them here is you need to, whatever marriage situation you have, you need to stay in that marriage situation unless it's obviously sinful. You know, if somebody was married to two different people, you gotta fix that. That can't be. But what he's trying to get them to understand, he's trying to get these spouses to say to realize this. Listen, you're saved, you get saved, but your spouse is not saved. Stay there as long as you possibly can. Don't leave that relationship. Stay there. But he'll mention several different walks of life. Okay? So, verse 17, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. So continue in that life, okay? And so I ordain in all the churches. Verse 18, was anyone called while circumcised? Awkward. Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Now, we're gonna cheat a little bit. Go down to verse 23. Go down to verse 23, and then we'll go back up in just a moment. But verse 23. At the end of this little section, Paul says, "You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men." Okay? Now I want you to think about this, verse 18. Why does he have to talk about circumcision? That's so weird and awkward and strange. It's like, why would he? Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised? I mean, first of all, let's just ask a question here. If you're circumcised, how do you get uncircumcised? That's not going to happen. And then he says, was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not become circumcised. Now, there's something bigger going on here. It's not just about cutting a piece of skin away from the flesh. That's not what he's getting at here. What he's getting at is this, that there were some Christians in the early church that were taught and told, and they thought that they had to, they were not Christians, and they were not Jews. And they actually thought, some of the guys thought, I have to become a Jew first and then become a Christian. And in order to be a Jew, I've got to get circumcised and then I can get saved. There were some Jewish teachers who were going around telling the guys that. And so that's why Paul says, no, If you got saved and you were not circumcised, he's telling them, you don't have to go be a Jew first and then come back and be a Christian. So you don't have to go get circumcised and then come back. So that's what Paul's getting at. He's saying, no, you don't have to go do that. No, you just go straight to Christ, is what he's trying to tell them. Verse 19. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. It is an incredible statement to come from a former Pharisee. Paul had been a Pharisee. And for him to say circumcision is nothing. I mean, for the Jews, that wasn't everything, but it was a requirement. You had to do that. In order to be one of God's, you had to be circumcised. You had to go through the rite of circumcision. And now Paul is saying, it's nothing. It's a cut on the body. It means nothing. It doesn't get you any closer to God or any further from God if you don't do it. He's saying it's nothing. Remember in verse 23, he said, don't become slaves to men. Because see, somebody would try to put a trip like, oh, you're a Christian? Oh, but brother, have you been circumcised yet? If you haven't proselytized into Judaism and then come back, you can't really be a Christian. And Paul's saying phooey on all of that. That doesn't make any sense. He's saying it's nothing. He says what counts is obedience, but keeping the commandments of God. Obedience to God. That's it. Obedience to God in whatever state you're in. Verse 20. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Check this out. Paul says in verse 21, were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. The word concerned means what we think it means, and he says, don't care about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. Slavery was the norm in that culture at that time. An absolute norm. I mean, it had the blessing of the state, the government. I mean, it was just, everybody had slaves. Now, for us, especially here in America, we obviously are familiar with slavery. I mean, we've heard about it, we've read about it, and lately, especially over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've heard a lot about it. We've learned a lot of things, or maybe at least, I shouldn't say we've learned a lot, but we've heard a lot about it. And how horrible it was. And in fact, I'm going to say something here. And in fact, probably, I mean, I wasn't there, obviously, but from my reading, my studying, things that I've learned over the years, it sounds like most of the slavery that took place here in this country was terrible. It was bad. Oftentimes horrific, the things that were done to slaves. Horrific. But there were also some situations, even here in America, where some of the slaves testified or even wrote that they loved their masters and their families, that they were treated so well there, that sometimes the slaves, even here in America, sometimes the slaves, after they were set free, they had fulfilled their time, they wouldn't leave. They would stay. And they would continue working for the master. Some people don't like that. They're angry about that. Like, they shouldn't do that. They should have left and whatever else. But okay, well, I don't know. What do you want me to do? You want me to go back and change it? We can't go back and change it. It is what it is. But the truth is that in some of those situations, the situation was that it worked out for some people. There are lots of accounts of that. There are also obviously some horrific accounts of things that were done to slaves. The way that they were treated, killed, it was horrific. And it was a good thing that slavery was abolished here. Whether people were being treated well or not or whatever, it's a good thing that it was abolished. If you were here on Sunday morning, you got to see that quick video about William Wilberforce, and over in the British Parliament, and how they actually ended slavery 30 years before we did. They ended slavery, and then we had obviously a civil war that eventually ended it. This is a good thing. But I want you to see what Paul is saying here in verse 21. Were you called while a slave? do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, if you can gain your freedom, he says, then you should get your freedom and use it. But the first thing he said was, he's speaking to the slaves in the Corinthian church. So the first thing that we need to realize is, wait, there were slaves in the church? Yes. There were slaves in the church. And Paul, what did Paul just say to him? Did he say revolt, sign a petition, overthrow the government, gather up all of your slave friends and, attack your masters and let's have a slave revolt? No. He actually said in verse 21, were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. Don't worry about it. It's like, what? We see that as just like, how could he possibly say that? But I want you to understand something. There were slaves in the church. And obviously, those slaves that were in the church had the freedom from their masters to be at church. Now, I suppose that there were probably some cases where they were sneaking and, maybe they were supposed to be at the marketplace, but they went and, they bought their things, they got the groceries and ran over to the Bible study or whatever. I'm sure that there were some of those cases. But they were known in the church. They were slaves. They knew that they were slaves. And Paul doesn't say anything about the government or complain against, the ruler or the masters or any of that. He just says if you got saved when you were a slave, he says don't worry about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. In other words, don't worry about, hey, I got to not be a slave anymore because I'm a Christian. In other places, he will tell the slaves, just serve your master well. Be a blessing to him. Isn't that a wild thought? That whatever situation I'm in when I get saved, just be content there. Just serve God right there. Don't look for ways to I got to get out of here as fast as I can. Verse 22, he says, for he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. And you might say, well, that's easier for you to say, Paul, you weren't a slave. And so he says in verse 22, likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. I mean, we can look at Paul and go, well, that's easy for you to say, Paul, you weren't a slave. Really? I mean, do you know anything about Paul and some of the hardships that he encountered? Anybody? Anybody remember any of the hardships that he encountered? Anybody? Anybody? I dare you. Anybody remember anything? Somebody said shipwrecked. Shipwrecked. Okay, what else? Anybody remember? What's that? Flogged. Yes. Yep. Flogged meaning whipped. Okay. Beaten.
Yeah.
Is that what you're going to say? Same thing? Okay. Anybody else remember? You remember that one time? I don't remember the name of the city now, but I love the story where he's preaching and they take him outside the city walls and they stone him and they leave him for dead. He had been bitten by a snake. Remember that when he was on the island of, I don't remember what island it was, but he was gathering wood and the snake bit him. He had been beaten, whipped more than once. He had been beat up. He had been stoned. He had, there were times where he said when he was homeless, sleeping out in the open, no home, and just all of this crazy enough, mistreated. So he could say this. He could say, for he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. However, likewise, he who is called while free, Paul was free, is Christ's slave. He certainly was Christ's slave. Paul was very familiar with the slave life. He understood what it meant to be a servant and a servant to Jesus. And we would think, serving Jesus, man, he just got, royal treatment. In fact, it was the exact opposite. You almost wonder, man, God, I thought he was your servant. You don't like this guy or what? He had been in prison. The guy had faced all kinds of difficulties. He knew what it was like to be a slave. He was a slave to Christ. He chose to do it. He chose to do it. Verse 23, he says, you were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren or brothers, and I think that includes sisters also, everybody, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Now, again, Paul doesn't give us a lot of detail, and there are some things that we might have to question or fill in, I should say. Not necessarily question, but we would want to say, well, again, We've heard of, prostitutes getting saved. Should they stay in that lifestyle? No. They obviously should seek to get out of that lifestyle as fast as they can. What about somebody who's in a gang? I met I've met lots of them, but I met another guy last night. He lives up in the desert, up in 29 Palms, Yucca Valley area, and I said something about San Bernardino, and he goes, "Oh yeah," he goes, "I did time in San Bernardino," and this was a guy who was serving the Lord, and he's on the worship team, and he's volunteering his time at the Bible college there. I mean, he loves the Lord, but he had been in a gang, he had been in that lifestyle. So if I get saved, but I'm in a gang, should I just go ahead and stay in the gang? No. No, not if that means doing what gangs do. No. But basically, what Paul is remember, he's trying to talk to these married couple. He's trying to tell them, look, just everybody, you get saved. Just all you need to do is focus on serving the Lord. God will move you around as He sees fit. But don't try to if you get saved, but you've got a bunch of friends that aren't saved, and man, I just got saved, you should do your best to try to reach them for Christ. You should do your best to minister to them. Not, get away from me. You guys have, you're unsaved. You have, unchristian cooties, and don't ever talk to me again. And, I'm so much better than you or whatever. A lot of people think that about us already. Like, what, you're too good? You can't hang out just because you're a Christian now? So I want to do my best, whatever state I'm in when I get saved, to try and reach those people. That's what happened with me. I got saved when I was 20 years old. I had a group of friends, and we had been together since high school hanging out, and now we were at the junior college, and we had spent a lot of time together going to partying. Basically, that was what we did. That's what we had in common. And then I get saved. No one else in the group is saved. And so what I did was I continued to hang out with them for a short time, but I was trying to share God's word with them. I didn't know much. All I knew that, man, it was I got saved. God forgave my sins. And so trying to express that to them, trying to share that with them. But at a certain point, they rejected it. So then at that point, I left that group of friends. But up until that point, I tried to stay. I tried to share the gospel with them. I tried to win them over to Christ, but they weren't having it. So it is for all of us. If you get saved, whatever position you're in or whatever, or maybe you might even be in one of those broken homes that we talked about. We call it broken home, where maybe mom's over here, dad's over here, and maybe somebody's mom or dad is saved and the other one's not, and you don't want to go to the other parent and go, I don't want to be with you anymore because you're not saved. You're so unholy or just so ungodly. Now there may come a time when going to their house is causing you to sin, because there may be things going on over there, and you might have to say, listen, I love you so much, but I don't want to come over here anymore if you're going to be doing this. Maybe there's partying going on, or what, I don't know, whatever. But you don't want to look at somebody and say, well, you're not a Christian, so I can't hang out with you anymore. We ought to do our best to try and stick around as long as we can, love them, and possibly even win them over to Christ. Father, thank you so much for your